On a quiet Thursday morning in 1980, the laws of physics over Lake Peigneur broke down. The water didn't just drain. It reversed its flow. Not smoothly. Not over a few weeks. Instantly. What began as a shallow fishing spot turned into an unstoppable vortex. The raw pulling power was so absolute that 11 heavy transport barges, an entire botanical garden, and a towering 150-foot oil rig were sucked straight down. But this wasn't an act of God. It wasn't a tectonic shift or a natural disaster. It was a system designed to be safe, failing completely. Every layer of safety worked, until one assumption broke everything. And it all came down to a single measurement that was off by just 14 inches. To comprehend how an entire ecosystem can vanish from the face of the earth, you have to look more than 1,000 feet straight down. For decades, Lake Peigneur, located in the heart of Louisiana, was utterly normal. It was barely 10 feet deep. Locals fished the calm waters for bass. Families walked the botanical gardens along the surrounding shore. But hidden directly beneath the mud, completely invisible to the fishermen floating above, was a massive anomaly. Jefferson Island, bordering the edge of the lake, wasn't an island at all. It was a geographic mound forced upward over millennia by a massive pillar of solid salt. This subterranean salt dome spanned roughly 3 miles across and dropped thousands of feet deep into the Earth's crust. Commercially, it was a gold mine. And in late 1980, 50 men were working deep inside it. The Diamond Crystal Salt Company had spent decades systematically carving chambers out of the pure rock salt. These weren't just small mining tunnels. The company had engineered an intricate underground city 1,300 feet below the surface. Using the room and pillar mining method, they intentionally left gigantic pillars of salt untouched to support the weight of the earth above. The excavated rooms were so massive that a 60-story skyscraper could fit comfortably inside them. But their position came with one terrifying risk: if anything ever punctured the ceiling of this massive salt dome, the entire 1,100-acre lake above them had nowhere else to go but down. Directly over their heads, floating oblivious on the shallow surface of Lake Peigneur, was an exploration drilling rig known as Diamond M Rig 59. 2 corporate entities were operating simultaneously. Both knew the acute danger of the local geology. But they trusted the math. The engineers possessed exactly the right blueprints. They possessed state-of-the-art geographical data. They mapped exactly where to place their million-dollar equipment to safely drill for deep oil reserves directly beside the salt mine. But due to a microscopic surveying interpretation, a clerical error converting standard transverse map grids, the massive drill string wasn't sliding safely past the outer wall of the mine. It was aiming directly at the roof of the highest cavern below. And at 4:30 a.m., that exact mistake finally collided with reality. Under the cover of darkness, the Texaco crew was running standard operating procedures. Their heavy 14-inch drill bit churned through the earth, aiming to hit a depth of 8,000 feet. As the digital depth monitor hit 1,200 feet, the entire steel drill string jammed in place. It struck something impossibly hard. At first, the experienced rig hands assumed it was a routine stuck pipe. What they didn't realize was that their 14-inch drill bit had perfectly punctured the protective ceiling of the Diamond Crystal Salt mine below. What happened next shouldn't have been physically possible. As they worked mechanically to free the heavy machinery, the crew heard a sequence of sharp, terrifying pops ringing out from the steel towers surrounding them. The structure, floating safely on 200-foot pontoons just moments before, began to list to one side. Just a few inches. Then a foot. The rig supervisor, sensing a fundamental failure in the earth beneath them, did not wait for clearance. He ordered an immediate evacuation. Men scrambled for their lives into small aluminum escape boats, leaving their expensive tools on the deck and their coffee cups sitting warm on the tables. Safely back on the muddy shoreline, they stood in horrified silence as unseen forces began pulling their towering 150-foot rig beneath the surface. They had no way to reverse this. The lake was already lost. When you bore a hole into a foundational pillar of solid salt, and then dump an entire freshwater lake through that opening, nature obeys physics with ruthless efficiency. The freshwater methodically dissolved the edges of the tiny 14-inch hole, actively tearing the molecular structure of the salt apart and forcing the breach wider. As the hole exponentially widened, the sheer volume of water cascading through it accelerated enormously. There was no emergency shut-off valve. Gravity had total control. Within mere hours, that tiny mistake had eroded into a crater over 100 feet wide. At this point, there was no stopping it. The lake was no longer a lake, it was a drain. While the spectacle on the surface was horrifying, the true nightmare was unfolding 1,000 feet beneath the mud. Every second that passed meant millions of gallons of heavy, muddy water were slamming into the delicate ecosystem of the mine below. Deep in the cavernous expanse of the mine, the 50 workers were completely blind to the catastrophe unfolding in the sky above them. They were driving heavy loaders, moving massive salt deposits, unaware that an ocean of water was actively raining down on their facility. Without warning, an electrical short from the flooding water triggered the critical emergency fault systems. Alarms screamed to life, and red strobe lights began flashing against the jagged white boundaries of the salt walls. Then, miners near the upper shafts heard a noise that signifies total, undeniable doom underground, the deafening roar of a massive waterfall. As essentially an entire lake's worth of water slammed into the mine floor, it dragged an avalanche of mud, debris, and the twisted metal corpse of the oil rig down with it. The raging waters flooded the carved corridors, actively dissolving the giant salt pillars keeping the roof intact. The ceiling of the entire mining facility was caving in around them. The strict evacuation protocol gave all 50 men one singular command: abandon all equipment and reach the elevator shafts immediately. It was their only way out. An electrician named Junius Gaspard was stationed deep in one of the lowest sectors of the mine. As the sirens wailed, he glanced up a vertical shaft and saw a horrifying wall of churning, muddy water plummeting straight toward him. With absolutely zero space to turn his heavy machinery around, Gaspard threw his loader into reverse, driving backwards through the claustrophobic tunnels at maximum speed in a desperate race against the flood. Reaching the elevator shafts was only half the battle. The water was surging higher by the second, rapidly consuming the walls of the mine and turning dry corridors into raging rivers. The ultimate problem was the industrial elevators themselves. They were agonizingly slow, and could securely carry only 8 men per trip. It took brutal, tension-filled minutes for the heavy steel cage to painfully grind its way up the 1,300-foot shaft, release a handful of exhausted men into the sunlight, and descend back into the abyss. The remaining workers stood lined up in absolute darkness, helplessly watching the floodwaters rapidly rise around their boots, ready to swallow their livelihoods. In a stunning testament to their obsessive emergency drilling and sheer human discipline, not a single man panicked or broke from the line. Every miner waited their turn. Every miner boarded that final elevator trip. Just moments after the steel cage cleared the surface and the men stumbled out, the entire underground cavern completely flooded. A mapping error the price of a cup of coffee had erased a multi-million-dollar empire in a matter of hours. 50 men were trapped 1,300 feet underground, and somehow, every single one of them made it out alive. And then, everything went quiet. Back above ground, the crater wasn't simply emptying a lake. The volume of the cavern below was so huge that it was essentially vacuuming the entire surrounding landscape. The incredible force of the water falling 1,300 feet downward created an inescapable downward draft, sucking hundreds of acres of topsoil, towering trees, and pieces of Jefferson Island directly into the abyss. This suction reached such impossible levels that the nearby Delcom Canal, which historically flowed south specifically to drain into the Gulf of Mexico, was overpowered and forced to reverse direction. Salt water from the ocean was physically ripped miles inland, flowing backwards toward the massive vortex and creating a temporary 160-foot waterfall. To this day, it remains the tallest waterfall ever documented in the state of Louisiana. 11 enormous transport barges, historically used to haul heavy loads of salt and materials across the lake, were swept directly into the eye of the whirlpool. They spun uselessly like tiny bath toys, the tugboats completely unable to save them, before being sucked under and smashed into the flooded mine shafts beneath the surface. Simultaneously, as the billions of gallons of water plunged downward, it forcefully displaced the oxygen inside the gigantic caverns. This trapped, highly pressurized air sought the quickest path to the surface and erupted out of abandoned mine shafts on the shoreline, blasting mud geysers and awe-inspiring 400 feet into the sky. It was an event of total destruction. And amazingly, it ended almost as quickly as it began. When the chaos finally subsided and the water levels equalized days later, Lake Peigneur was unrecognizable. A shallow, 10-foot freshwater lake had been permanently transformed into a deep, oceanic saltwater ecosystem. 9 of the 11 sunken barges eventually popped back up like corks, permanently damaged. Texaco paid $32 million in catastrophic damages to Diamond Crystal. But the water that reversed its flow that fateful morning never left. Lake Peigneur stands as pure proof that the sheer force of nature will always exploit the tiniest clerical error. A 14-inch surveying mistake on a blueprint erased an entire ecosystem from the map. It is one of the most terrifying engineering failures in American history. But it wasn't the last. Subscribe for more impossible disasters. I'll see you in the next one.